Ah, great. So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you. I'm really honored to be asked to join this conversation. This is an important conversation, and I think the decision to begin this conversation on campus, I think, is the right choice to try to frame this around the controversy surrounding Civil War monuments and specifically Confederate monuments. I think what you'll find is that the issues at the center of this debate, or the questions that it raises, are going to be some of the same questions that the Gallaudet community will have to consider. As you think about the way in which the past is commemorated and remembered on campus, whether that's through the naming of buildings and through other commemorative spaces that may be on campus. Fundamentally, I think this debate or this conversation is really about the values that we claim to embrace as members of a community. How we remember the past is almost always about the people doing the remembering, the people doing the commemorating. What does it say about us as members of a community? Again, what values do we claim to uphold and embrace? And I think, again, that is sort of what's at issue with the debate around the country that we've seen over the past few years about whether or not Confederate monuments, Confederate flags should remain in public spaces. And so what I want to do for you in about the 20, 25 minutes that I have is just give you an overview of sort of the history of the Confederate monuments and a sense of why these are so controversial in 2021. And so if you can go to the next slide. So the next slide, please. Great. This debate really started in 2015, and it started after the murders of 9 African-American churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina, murders that were committed by this young man by the name of Dylann Roof. And in the days, after Dylann Roof was finally caught by the police, photographs surfaced of him waving the Confederate flag. Photographs appeared of Dylann Roof being photographed in front of Confederate monuments. And we soon learned that Roof had thought about the murders in the weeks leading up to June 21st, 2015. He had framed his act as an act that stretched back to the Confederacy itself. Dylann Roof believed, he claimed that he wanted to start a race war with these murders. And he sort of identified himself in this long line of white supremacists that stretched back to the Civil War itself, to the Confederacy itself. The Confederacy, of course, that nation that existed between 1861 and 1865, that attempted to break up the Union, the United States, for the purposes of creating an independent slaveholding republic. And so Roof saw himself as a student of history, almost, as a student of the legacy of the Confederacy, right? Again, he saw himself within that larger narrative. And that led to the beginning of this conversation. Certainly, communities had debated their monuments and flags, but not in the way that we saw after the murders. It was a very different kind of debate, both in terms of the number of communities across the country that were engaged and the emotion of it all. And that led, again, to the removal of flags and monuments in a couple communities across the country. Next slide. And this continued into 2017. In August of 2017, in my former home of Charlottesville, Virginia. Many of you remember the Unite the Right rally that took place in Charlottesville. This rally that took place around the defense of a Confederate monument, a monument to Robert E. Lee, one of probably the most important Confederate general within the Confederate military. And here you can see that monument in the center of the square in Charlottesville. This is not a photograph from the day of the rally, but you can see the flags and you can see the monument. The rally that took place in August of 2017, you may remember, was incredibly violent. It played out on television, and it resulted in the death of one young woman by the name of Heather Heyer. Following this rally, a number of other communities also decided to remove their monuments, remove flags that had been located in public spaces. And that has continued right up until the present, right up until 2021. In fact, following the police murder of George Floyd last year in May of 2020, since then, roughly 90 Confederate monuments have been removed in cities and towns across the country, mainly, of course, in the South, in the former Confederate states. And so this is, again, this is a conversation that is a debate that is divisive, and that raises, fundamental questions about how a community remembers the past in its public spaces, whether or not these monuments reflect the values that the people, who live in these places claim to uphold. And so one way to actually think about this is to imagine for yourself, those monuments or memorials that actually do the work that we expect them to do. In other words, that they bring people together, that they bring people together around a shared narrative, that we find common values. I tend to think that the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. is a good example of this. On any given day, you can see people from all over the world, all over the country, different racial backgrounds, coming together inside that monument, finding some common ground. I think you can also find it in the Vietnam War Memorial, also in DC, a very different kind of memorial, obviously, but one that also brings people together around a shared past, raises questions that all of us have to deal with. And so in thinking about monuments that actually do the work that we expect them to do, it's sometimes helpful to think about what happens when they no longer do that work. What happens when our monuments divide, right? And that, of course, is what we're seeing right now. And I think that's one of the reasons why this particular subject is such a good way of beginning your conversation. Hopefully it won't get as heated, as divisive, but in the end, this is what it means to live in a democracy, right? This is one of those moments, I would suggest it's healthy to be forced to think about how the past is commemorated in our own spaces, in our local spaces. It's a healthy discussion overall. So let's go to the next slide. And I can begin to give you a sense of why this is so controversial today. What is the root of the problem? And one thing I want you to notice about this graph, this timeline, this sort of plots the monuments, the building names and roads that were named in honor of Confederates over time. And obviously, I want you to look at that spike that you see there on the timeline. And one of the things that's important to recognize right at the get-go is that the vast majority of Confederate monuments that we're debating today were dedicated at a specific point in time, not right after the end of the American Civil War in 1865, but decades later, roughly beginning in the 1880s and then sort of moving along into the 1930s. That's when the vast majority of these monuments are dedicated. And the reason why that's important is because these monuments were dedicated at a time when the vast majority of African Americans were disfranchised, were legally barred from engaging in the kinds of sort of political processes or just being able to take part in public debates about how their own communities should honor the past, remember the past in their public spaces. And so many of the monuments that are coming down, that are being discussed, again, went up when only white Americans had a stake in it. Only white Americans were able to shape what kinds of monuments go up and who they honor and why. And that's a problem, right? That's a big problem. And it's only in the last few years that African Americans and others have been able to voice protests or protest these monuments, share a counter narrative, if you will, that was always present, but only in the last few years is really beginning to make an impact. And one of the things I want to point out, so if you can go to the next slide. One of the things I want to point out real fast is that many of these monuments, and you can see the little circles here on the map, they represent individual Confederate monuments. One of the things I want you to notice here is that in many of these localities, in many of these counties, when these monuments went up, they went up in places where the majority of the population was African American. So if you look at those brown areas, right, in the map, in these former Confederate states, wherever there's a circle in a brown area, that would be a county, right? That was predominantly, that was majority African American. So sometimes today you'll hear people say, well, these Confederate monuments no longer represent the collective values or the shared past of everyone in the community. And that is, I think, certainly the case. But one of the things I want you to understand or acknowledge here is that for many of these monuments, they never did. They never represented the shared past and the collective values of the majority of the population. And that, I think, is important just to sort of, again, to acknowledge, because it demonstrates how important it is that everyone have a seat at the table, that everyone in the community have an opportunity to actually contribute to these important discussions. Everyone is invested in these questions about how our public spaces are utilized, okay? So let me sort of make some of these points in a bit more, in reference to individual monuments, and I want to drive some of these points home in the time that I have left. So if you can go to the next slide. And here you can see one of the most important Confederate monuments. This is the Lee Monument, the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia. It was dedicated in 1890. It was one of 5 Confederate monuments that eventually lined what's called Monument Avenue. And the other 4 have been removed. This is the last one. There's a pending lawsuit that is going to be heard by the state government in Virginia, by the state Supreme Court, excuse me, in Virginia. And I suspect it will be removed at some point in the near future. But when this was dedicated, there were roughly 150,000 white Virginians, white Americans who took part. It took place in what you can see is an open field, but it was also a location that was under development. This was going to be a new real estate venture for the city of Richmond. In fact, if you look to the left of the monument, you can see 2 roads intersecting. You can see the beginning of this new neighborhood, what's called the West End neighborhood, begin to take shape. And this is an important thing to sort of focus on, because it reinforces an important point, and that is that monuments help to define space. They help to define who lives where, what groups of people live where. In this case, it helped to reinforce racial segregation. And the next slide actually helps to make this point very clearly. So as I mentioned, this was the Lee Monument, and the other Confederate monuments were part of a new real estate venture in the western section of Richmond. And here are 2 newspaper ads that were taken out by the real estate companies in a Richmond newspaper. And the one on the left shows the Stonewall Jackson monument, which had yet to go up. But notice the real estate companies were using these monuments to advertise the empty lots that would be sold to families who would build their homes basically in the shadow of these Confederate monuments. But these lots were only sold to white people, to white families. And I don't know if you can see it, but if you look at the advertisement on the right, you'll see that little box that says restrictions. And if you actually look real close, what it basically says in the first line is that these lots will not be sold to people of African descent. So right from the beginning, these Confederate monuments helped to do the work of racial segregation. And that is one of the reasons why this part of Richmond remains overwhelmingly white, upscale, many of the homes in this area, throughout much of the 20th century. How we commemorate the past, this is not passive. These monuments are not passive artifacts. They are constantly doing the work of not only reminding people of the past, but doing the work that the people who helped dedicate them wanted to achieve. And in this case, helping to create a new neighborhood for white Richmonders, right? So go to the next slide and we can continue. This is another example of how these monuments define space and define space for certain people. One of the things that's important to acknowledge about these monuments, these Confederate monuments, is that they never shied away from sort of announcing or taking pride in white supremacy. Many of the inscriptions announce this or reinforce this. Here is the monument in Augusta, and the inscription reads, "No nation rose so white and fair, none fell so pure of crime." And again, these monuments were intended to represent the entire population, the local population. Again, but in Augusta and other parts of Georgia, that was probably never the case, right? And so this is one of the places today they're debating what should be done with this monument, given the inscription, given the broader history. Next slide. Another way of trying to understand these monuments is by looking at the speeches that were given at their dedications. And I chose two here, and I'm not going to read all of it. You can skim through it if you want. But I chose two of these soldier statues because quite often the soldier statues were placed in front of public buildings, courthouses, where people would have voted, where they would have gone to seek justice, right? And what does it mean to have a Confederate soldier statue in front of it? It raises the question of how these statues reinforce who is welcomed in these buildings, who is considered to be a full citizen, right? So again, these structures are not passive artifacts. They are constantly doing the work that the people who dedicated them wanted to achieve. And this is an important example because in the dedication addresses, that work often emerges very clearly. And here is Wiley Nash, a Confederate veteran who gave one of the dedication addresses. What did he hope that this monument would achieve? Well, go down to number 5. It will help to a true understanding of home rule, white home rule, he would have meant there, and local self-government, contending for which the South lost so many of her best and bravest. It will serve to keep the white people of the South united, a thing so necessary to keep, protect, preserve, and transmit our true Southern social system, our cherished Southern civilization. So again, very rarely do speakers shy away from raising the importance of maintaining white control during the Jim Crow era, reminding young white Southerners who never experienced the war of their responsibility to uphold the racial status quo, the racial hierarchy that placed white people at the top. Go to the next slide, please. And I'll just give you another quick example, an even more controversial example from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. This is the Silent Sam statue that was removed by students at UNC in August of 2018, in large part because of this dedication address. And another veteran delivered it by the name of Julian Carr. And what's so interesting is that in the middle of the speech, he asks his audience to go back with him in time to the spring of 1865, after he had just returned from the war, to re-experience this moment. 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days perhaps after my return from Appomattox from the war, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds, because upon the streets of this quiet village, she had publicly insulted and maligned a Southern lady. It seems to me that what Carr is doing there is reminding once again his audience that the work that their parents and grandparents failed to achieve in the Civil War, to create an independent slaveholding republic, was now their responsibility, that they still had a responsibility to put the pieces back together as much as possible, those pieces being that racial hierarchy. And I think this message would have been a very emotional one for people, who experienced the end of the war, actually seeing African Americans, formerly enslaved people, practicing freedom, walking down the street, right, when they want, wearing the kinds of clothing they want, engaging in behavior that white people would have seen as disrespectful. And I think this kind of sort of moment that he's describing would have resonated with people, with white people in the early 20th century, who still have that responsibility to maintain that unity and maintain that white kind of cohesion, that white control, that white supremacy in a place like Chapel Hill. So one of the things I want to sort of remind you of then is that the question of whether these monuments should remain, these questions about whether our buildings should remain named in honor of certain people, is not so much about history. Nothing will be erased from the past if a building name is changed or a monument is removed. What's at stake here is whether or not the monument or the name of the building, again, represents who we take ourselves to be. The students at Chapel Hill, residents of other communities, their decision to remove over the last few years these monuments is a reflection, not that they want to erase the past, but they want to change how the past is remembered and honored. And so that distinction between history and memory is something that we need to come back to if we have the time. We should return to this theme during the time we have today. So if you can go to the next slide, I'm going to try to finish up pretty fast here. And just a quick reminder that even if African Americans didn't have the opportunity to raise their own monuments, dedicate their own monuments in public spaces, they still made the effort to share the stories that they felt important to pass down from generation to generation. And that in a place like Richmond, they would have taken opportunities in every April and other important dates to remind their children and grandchildren of the service of their grandparents in the Civil War as Black soldiers in the United States Army, of the arrival of the Union Army in Richmond in April of 1865, of the efforts to challenge the Confederacy by running away and doing other things that would have undercut the Confederate war effort. That African Americans had a very different memory of the war. And just because it wasn't visible on the monument landscape doesn't mean that it wasn't present and that it wasn't continuing to be passed down, again, from one generation to the next over the course of the 20th century, right? And that, I think, is what has emerged, right? This counter narrative against these monuments over the past few years, that these monuments erase the past. They erase a more complicated understanding of the past for political reasons. So the next slide. and I'll just real fast, these are just the last sort of 2 or 3 slides. These monuments also distort the history they claim to honor. And one of the ways they do this is through the monuments. And this is the monument in Arlington National Cemetery, the Confederate monument dedicated in 1914 by the United Daughters of the Confederacy with the help of President Woodrow Wilson, who gave one of the dedication addresses. You can see the children, always an important aspect of a Confederate dedication ceremony. They're the ones who need to hear the lessons that their parents and grandparents want passed down. You can see the gravestones there around the base of the monument. But if you look closely at the monument itself, and so go to the next slide, you can see how these monuments actually distort the past, mythologize the past, and again reinforce this distinction between history and memory, that monuments are not history lessons. They are not an attempt to provide a critical, objective look at the past. They are an attempt, again, to transmit a certain set of values that the community responsible for them wants to realize. And here you can see 2 examples. Just right of center, you can see the image of the so-called faithful mammy servant, the loyal slave that will never run away from her master, that will remain loyal to her master during the war, even as he goes off to fight in a war that, if successful, will keep her enslaved. And so notice that she's taking care of the child as he gets ready to go off. And then notice just left of center, you can see what appears to be a uniformed Black man marching off with Confederate soldiers. That is the image of the loyal body servant, of the loyal camp servant. Again, the loyal slave who will remain by his master's side even through the war itself, that he will never run away to the Union Army, will never run off to seek his freedom. It's a reminder that in 1914, when this was dedicated, it's a powerful message that seems to suggest that African Americans never wanted to be free. And if they never wanted to be free in the 1860s, then whites can be justified in 1914 in maintaining them as second-class citizens. And so again, it's a reminder that these monuments are helping to do the work of maintaining a racial hierarchy, of maintaining segregation, as I discussed before. And that's something that we can continue to talk about during the rest of the session. So if you go to the last slide, or the last 2 slides, just real fast, I'll stop here. This is the Lee Monument today. And if you go to the next slide, it's an even starker contrast. This is the Lee Monument today. And what we've seen over the last few months is a remarkable transformation since the shooting of George Floyd in May. Richmonders and others who never had a reason to visit the site of the Lee Monument have done so, and in doing so have utterly transformed it, have transformed the meaning of the Lee Monument, have reminded the community of a very different history, one that includes Black abolitionists like Frederick Douglass on the right, others like Harriet Tubman. Most recently, the image of a Black Union soldier was projected on the monument, and even more recent African-American leaders like John Lewis. And it's a reminder to me that this is important work, that this is that these monuments, these spaces, that they matter. And they matter because they are, again, a reflection of who we take ourselves to be. And my hope is that regardless of sort of what happens in these places, that the community takes steps to transform them, in ways that that for the first time perhaps reflect a more inclusive history, and for the first time reflect those common values. So thanks for listening.